Okay, I'm going to go through an in-depth course on teaching you how to become an expert in grading lenses. I'm going to cover basically 95% plus of everything anybody will encounter. That way, when you get a new lens, before you leave that positive feedback on eBay or you meet some schmuck off of Craigslist in a parking lot or in the coffee shop, and you got like a 5-minute inspection on a lens, you can go down this checklist and find out whether you've got a lemon or not. There's some things that people cover up, and there's a lot of things that you probably won't look for. Point number one, what you can see and what you can't see. Don't want to buy a lens that's a refurbished lens. You're buying one off of eBay, never buy a refurbished lens. Even if it's an Icon factory refurbished, what actually happens to lenses that cause them to go back to be rebuilt, unless it's something simple like a internal drive motor on an autofocus Nikkor, then that's one thing. Most often it's abuse or something horrible, and even then I would not trust Nikon to fix the lens, because why? Typically, even a Nikon factory refurbished lens is not worth it. The price is the same as a decent used lens that hasn't been refurbished. So, love Nikon, but I'm not going to trust them to fix a lens, so never buy a factory refurbished lens by anybody. Most people will never state that unless somebody's actually honest and states it on a website, but most camera stores know not to do that. Another thing to look for in the back of the ring mount is look for any tampering to these screw heads. And if you notice that they've been burred, that means someone's taken it apart and cleaned it. You know, they may have degreased it, unless it's a really cheap lens. Price-wise, would not buy it. If you notice any tampering on the mounts to remove, to disassemble the lens, always avoid that. Other things you need to be looking for in CPU lenses is a check for damaged contacts. Okay, these little CPU contacts here. These are actually the first thing that will show corrosion on a lens if it's been stored in like a humid basement or somewhere else like that. Check for corrosion on the CPU contacts. One thing that typically happens, and of course these lenses get older, obviously so, is that there is a helicoid inside these older AI and AIS lenses and non-AI lenses, and what I'm doing right now is a lot of grease right in here, and it's a helicoid. It's like a corkscrew vortex that when you're actually doing this, well, why is that so smooth? It's certainly not metal to metal. Well, yeah, it kind of is. There's a bunch of grease in there. Even like on a modern day $2,000 Zeiss lens, which are manual focus lenses, if you zoom like their macro 100mm all the way out and look inside the back of the lens, you can actually see a big wobbin hunk, just a big cow pie of grease that just goes around one side and around the other. So even in these old lenses, what happens is that people store them in a hot attic, or they've kept them, God knows where, and it's in Arizona. It could still be someplace hot and humid. What happens is the grease dries out, and check for how smooth the focus is. If you actually have to apply more than moderate pressure to focus the lens, unless you know how to take it apart, and a lot of them, about 60% of them are way too much of a pain in the butt to take apart. You do not want to have to remove the old grease and re-grease it. And if you send it off to have it re-greased, it's going to cost you 60 to 80 bucks anyway, depending on how complex the lens is. Like send it off to Peach Photo in Georgia or KEH Photo in Georgia to be refurbished and re-greased. So you always want to avoid that. And I've got like 4 or 5 lenses that are like that. Some of them, I have to go, to actually focus the lens. So always check for that. Luckily here, I've got some damaged lenses to give you examples of. Now, there are 2 things that occur in older lenses like this, and this is a screw drive. It's an AFD. Screw drive means that there's actually a slot on the motor of your D7100 and above that actually engages with this flat slot right here to actually drive the mechanics of this lens. So, I want you to listen for something. This also occurs in AFS motors that actually have built-in internal motors. The only difference is that there is power fed from the camera to the motor, which drives the lens. In this case, it's mechanically driven on this lens, so there's a motor inside the camera. So what can happen? You can have a damaged lens and a perfect camera, but if the camera's driving a lens that has slipping gears like this one does, and what will happen is it'll encounter a snag where it can't focus, and this lens is dangerous in that it can damage the camera, your perfectly working camera, because, let's see, let me hit that sweet spot. about once in every, there we go, right there, there's a snag, there's a catch. See, anyway, it'll catch right there, and what that'll do is it'll burn out the motor on your camera. Now this also happens in AFS, silent wave motors, where the motor is internal and power is fed from the camera through the lens CPU contacts to feed the motor, and then of course the lens will give out. It'll actually catch and it'll burn up the motor. There's a snag right there. It'll burn out the motor inside the lens. However, it's always certainly, of course, better to burn out the motor in your lens than your camera, but you certainly don't want a lens like that. Another thing is I always do the sniff test. Yeah, this is one time where a sniff test applies. Sniffing the lenses for, some sort of, chain smoker, so far as the lens smelling like smoke. Check also if the aperture ring slips, or if it actually is properly tensioned. The first thing I'll actually do, before I get to that, let me grab this lens here. All of these have issues. Is make sure that the aperture ring doesn't catch. It's actually somewhat common not only to have dried grease in the aperture ring. There isn't grease back here in the focus ring, dried grease in the focus ring, but here in the aperture ring is not a dried grease issue, but sometimes these are so dirty and clogged up with grease, it means the lens has gotten hot and the grease has migrated down here and dried up, that the aperture ring doesn't properly engage, or it's really, really, really stiff, and that's an issue. That's also another lens that you want to avoid. Secondly, I want to check your aperture blades for oil. I've got an oily aperture blade somewhere. Lens, a couple of them actually. What you'll do is you'll look in here, stick your finger on this little lever right in the back that engages the aperture to open and close, okay? And what you're going to do is you're going to open it and let it go. See if it snaps back into place. And while doing that, look down here. You'll see it on the edges where they make contact. Look for greasy spots, and that's oil. And that's an issue, because what that does is it causes retardation of the aperture, and that'll affect your shots, because it'll actually cause retardation of the aperture to close, and the shots will come up with bad exposures because the aperture is not closing nice and snappy like it's supposed to be. You read people talk about whether the aperture is nice and snappy or not. That's what they're talking about. The grease or the actual oil that's on those aperture blades will retard the opening and closing of those. Now that can actually be kind of easily cleaned, but nobody's into fixing lenses. You take out the aperture assembly and you soak it in a little bin of acetone and you flick it open and shut several times, and that'll actually remove all of the oil and grease off at your aperture assembly, but that's something else nobody wants to do. This is also something very common, is that people will knock lenses going through doorways and whatnot, so look for bent filter rings on lenses. Something else, you should be able to hear this. This one actually has a loose secondary element. You think that's the lens hood? It's not. It's actually a loose element. Listen closely. So this lens actually has a loose secondary. I hadn't gotten around to fixing it yet. But that's something you need to do with every lens like this that you grab, is shake it like this in various different directions of its axis. That, folks, is a loose element. Loose element! That's never good. You don't want to oh, well, I'll give you a discount. Never buy it. Even like me, if I can fix the lens, I'm getting too old. It's too much of a pain in the butt. Don't want to do it. Don't buy it. Fungus. Fungus is a bad thing, but sometimes it's nowhere near as bad as you think. The bigger the front element is, the less you got to worry about it. You can actually chisel a chunk of glass out of the front of this lens, and it still won't show up on the rear element. Foo bars on the front element, while they look really, really bad, not so bad. You got issues on the rear element, that's pretty bad. So whatever you can get away with, here's the general rule, whatever you can get away with on the front element, you can't get away with on the rear element as far as affecting the image. Fungus. What does fungus look like? Fungus among us. It looks like a little tiny veinous spider web, kind of like a web that creeps outwards, kind of like a little spider. You see a big one right there? Yep, and there's some little bitty babies. You can kill it with an ultraviolet light. It's actually a little growth in there, like a petri dish, where it kind of spreads out. You can kill it, but that doesn't remove it. You actually have to take the lens apart. Now, one like this I haven't cleaned. Why? Because this is a big 300 millimeter f4.5, and that you're like, oh my god, that's a huge fungus spot. Yeah, but it doesn't affect the pictures at all. It doesn't, because it is on the secondary element. It's on the surface of the secondary element. And while it does look honking and huge, because this lens is so damn big, it's not an issue. The rest of the lens, I got this lens for really, really cheap. Everybody else was like, oh my god, fungus, I'm not going to buy it. I was like, well, hell yeah, I'll buy that lens that cheap. Are you kidding me? I can fix it, but I know that knowing where this fungus is, that it is not going to affect the picture. It's not. It doesn't. It looks horrible. Nobody wants to buy it like this. That's why I buy lenses like this. That's a tip for you about buying lenses. Okay, even if it's like a 2.8, like this lens right here, and had a spot just as big, it still wouldn't affect the image. Now, if it's all over the damn place, and it's between not just one element, but it's just like creeping all over the place, that means some schmuck has been storing this lens in a wet basement or something like that, and you just don't want to buy it. But that one big spot, it's no big deal. It's easy to remove. Doesn't affect the images. Unknown dust and crud. If people are dirty, nasty slobs, and the outside of the lens looks like crap, then typically the inside of the lens looks like crap. One of the pet peeves of mine is that people list stuff on eBay and they won't even brush off the outside of the lens. Like, Jesus, you know, take 10 seconds to clean it. I mean, it's ridiculous. Clarity and haze. Here's one thing where you should never say yes, no matter what the hell the price is, because it is so pervasive that it just creeps all over the damn place, and the lens is just like, screw it, shoot it between the eyeballs and bury it in a deep hole. That is haze. Haze! I've got I've got one lens that's got haze in it. I don't know where it's at. Typically it won't show up until you hit a bright scene, or especially if you have any incident like sunlight coming in, striking. What it looks like is like a milky, it looks like to most people dust. When they actually shine a light through it, it will look like, so that's dust. No, because dust looks like little fine particles. Dust looks like exactly what it is. Dust. However, it is the case that haze kind of looks like milky, flat dust. And what that is it means someone's got the lens really hot, and all that grease right here in the helicoid, it is migrated all over the place and attached itself as thin little teeny spots, and you really only see it by shining a light through it. Now this actually is typical dust for a lens this old. Someone else will look through this lens and go, oh my god, that's a lot of dust. Doesn't affect the picture at all, doesn't affect anything. But it'll look like a milky haze, so dust looks like dust. You'll see it as three-dimensional little particles. Haze, to most people, kind of looks like dust, but it's not. It looks like a milky, flat, speckling, kind of like someone flinged microspeckles all over a wall. And when you got haze in a lens, forget it. Don't buy it at any price. Haze is what they call in the camera world, screw that, I ain't buying it. And you don't want to clean it either. Doesn't matter if you know how to fix lenses, just like, screw it, I ain't buying it. So if it's got haze, if anything says it's got haze or you see haze, don't buy it. AR coating. This is something else that freaks a lot of people out. They'll actually see, like, I got a lens that's got really bad coating to that. See that purple and greenish tint? That's actually vacuum deposited crystalline coating that reduces out reflectivity, both on the front element but internally as well, for maximum light transmission. You can have serious damage to the coating and not have damage to the lens. That's point one. Point two is that unless you get super perfect light, you'll never ever see, 99.99 times out of 100, you'll never see an issue with AR. And this is another way to grab really awesome lenses. Someone will say, well, the front element's got some coating damage to it. And I'm like, well, screw that. I mean, it's some of the best lenses out there that are rocking 50 years old, that professionals are all around. I mean, the front of them, the lenses aren't technically scratched, but the coating's all damaged and spotty to hell. That's not an issue. I mean, resale value creates an issue, and people look at it and go, ew, I'd never buy that lens. I'll be like, yeah, if that lens is cheap, I'll buy it, baby. Check out the overall condition of the lens. Typically, if the lens has been abused really bad or looks really abused, Actually, that's kind of a good sign. That means it's been a good lens and it's been well taken care of. It's like, well, how does that make sense? Well, it's been abused and well taken care of, and how could it be so heavily damaged? It means it's just gotten a tremendous amount of use. You can tell the difference between an abused lens and a very, very worn lens. Check for motor grinding. As I mentioned, slippage on focusing. Haze, never do that. Also look for bent aperture blades. It's actually not that uncommon. You'll actually look in. If you see one of the aperture blades that is crinkled, kind of like, you know, your dog hit the screen door and it's a little bit wobber-jawed or bent or crooked, say, no! That means it's about to fail. I already mentioned checking the CPU contacts and the aperture ring slippage. One other thing, and I can show you on this rather expensive lens, it looks like 100% on the outside. Some lenses have this issue, and it's somewhat common. It looks like broken or chipped glass, but what it is, there's a special glue called Balsam used to bind these old lenses. Some of them, many of them actually. Let's see if I can find it for you here. And typically you won't see it as an issue, but it'll look like broken glass. You're like, oh my god, that lens is broken on the inside. It's got a fracture. It looks like a fracture, but if you look really closely, you can see it there. It looks like a rainbow, which typically looks like, you know, broken glass, like the lens is a fracture. That's not what it is two elements that have been glued together, and the balsam that combined the two of them has degraded to the point where the lens is separating. That can actually kind of be easily fixed. I mean, the lens is still perfect. It's technically just glue that's cementing those two elements together, and it looks like a rainbow. You could see it right here. This is a really expensive fisheye, by the way. This lens is like 100% cosmetically, except for this balsam separation. It means someone stored it in a really nice dry place, or possibly a little bit hottish, and you got balsam separation. What that does is it's almost never really bad on balsam separation. What it does, however, to the lens is when you take the picture, it'll produce the same effects as haze. When you take any normal shot, it'll never show up, but if you shoot like incident light coming in, sunlight or whatnot, the image will look milky in that spot, and that's due to the balsam separation. So the lens is fine as long as you don't shoot with light coming in at all, and which is hard on a fisheye because the front element of that lens is pointing out everywhere. The light's going to grab it somehow. So that's going to create an issue with incoming light, and that is called balsam separation. Now I have gone over 95% plus of the issues that affect lenses that you need to check, and if you go down that list, like I said, the one thing that you always want to avoid is any gear grindage, like screw it, I ain't buying it. If it's got any haze at all, screw it, I ain't buying it, even if the lens is $5. No, not going to buy it. Everything else is manageable given a certain price, even if you're never going to fix the lens. Like I said, what you got to be warned about on fungus, not so bad if the lens is really cheap. You can kill it, it's not going to spread, but it's not going to remove it either. But, you know, it's got a spot or two of fungus, or it's just around. Typically, fungus is not dead smack in the middle like this. It is typically on the rear elements around the edges, or around the front element around the edges where some water's creeped in, some schmuck is taking it out in a rainstorm or something like that. Remember, what goes on here ain't so bad. On the front element, what happens on the rear element, that's where you got to worry. When you got a food-barred rear element, yeah, if it looks like it's got some bad scratches and, you know, some dog's been sandpapering his crotch on the rear element of the lens, you don't buy it. So, never haze, never grinding issues, and never rear element damage. It's got a micro scratch in the rear element, so damn what. But if it's got any significant damage or moderate damage at all in the rear element, no! Anyway, that's the expert course on learning how to grade lenses. If you like this video, you can drop me a buck or two. Go tell me to jump off a cliff, but I've just taught you more than you'll learn from anywhere else on YouTube on the subject. That way, it'll save you money, it'll make you safe, and you'll be confident in what you buy. Because I've just taught you the secrets on grading lenses. What to buy, what not to buy. Tell someone to shove off and take their lens with them. Right? Bye. Okay, thank you.